Hello everyone, welcome to Fuse Room. I'm Alberto. This video is about the Kiive Audio Complexx 760 compressor, expander, gate-ish limiter. The original I have never seen and I have never used, but it turns out you can use plugins even if you haven't used the original analog outboard. But as far as I know, it comes from the late 60s. It was made sort of to be pitched at broadcasters. And it's quite unique because it's a FET circuit, like FET, like an 1176, but the three sidechains, the detector circuit from the compressor, the one from the expander, and the one from the limiter are getting summed, and they're working onto the same FET circuit, which makes these compressor unit work with a very peculiar sound. Now, there's also a couple differences from the 1176s as well, like there's more ratios, there's an HF-LF tone, and it's the interaction between the expansion, compression, and limiting that really build the sound. It sounds good, so let's take a look at what it offers, and then we'll put it to use to a sketch that I have that is just perfect. So this is the plugin interface, and it's got the logo, the presets, the gain linking, which will link input and output knobs, the left plus right linking for the controls, the oversampling, the stereo width, very useful, and the THD, the general mojo of the unit that you can increase or decrease, and the mix percentage, which is a dry wet knob. You got AB, undo, redo, OpenGL, product info, UI size, typical stuff at the bottom that Kiive offers. Now, you look at this compressor, expander, limiter, right? This dynamic processor, that would be the right term, and you're instantly completely overwhelmed by the number of switches and knobs. Well, it's a two-channel compressor, expander, limiter. So the left channel mimics the right one and vice versa. Now they are mirrored controls. So you've got the input at the very left of the unit and you've got the output at the very right. Okay, so you can gain stage the unit. Anything that is happening between those two stages happens in the middle of the controls, but they are your main gain staging parameters. On top, in purple, you see these HF or LF tone. You could think of these as a tilt EQ. And again, it's duplicated because it's left and right channels, or mid and side, or channel 1 and channel 2. Right? So by turning these to HF, the sound becomes more high frequency driven, like you're tilting the attention of the unit and the tone of the box towards the high frequencies. Vice versa, you go to LF and it will focus more on the low frequencies. It sounds really good by itself. So even if you're not compressing, this could be nice to just give some attitude to the sound because your track takes a direction. So it wants to go somewhere and you can feel it in the unit. The curves are really nice. Then there's the 2 meters, obviously, and the center, which are gonna tell you the gain reduction, and your side chain for your left and right again. At the center, you have a mono operational mode, which is gonna be the unlinked 2-channel mode. Then you got a stereo, and then you got a mid-side version. So your left channel becomes mid, and the right channel becomes side. You got a master on off, which will completely disable the unit, and you got 2 lights per channel, expansion in green and limiting. When these things are turning on, it means that the circuit, respectively for expansion or limiting, are working. So it's a nice visual cue. Then you've got 2 more input-output knobs. Now, this is really nice because you have an additional level of gain compensation and calculations. You can bypass these stages specifically, so the unit is still on, you get the color, but you're not getting into compression, expansion. Or you can also decide whether or not you want to use the expansion and gate whatsoever. So while the compressor is always on, although you can put it to 1-to-1 ratio, the expansion/gate circuit can be entirely bypassed with off. Same happens for the peak limiting. So your compressor is always on, although you can put it to 1-to-1 ratio. The peak limiter is driven by this switch that goes to on, off, or pre-emphasis. Now, the pre-emphasis is pretty special, and they put it there for broadcast reasons. When you were peak limiting some programs, you would get some, I read, kind of modulation in the transient response that would kind of affect frequency modulation, FM radio results. Like it wasn't translating, exactly as it could. There were artifacts in it. So they added these pre-emphases, which had different calibrations for European or North American markets. It's very specific. But anyway, they modeled this color as well because, it's a different color, right? The expansion, again, can be engaged with the expansion switch to the left or to the right. It becomes a gate. Now, before we explore compression, expansion, and limiting, I want you to take a look at the input and output compensation for channels, which are offset based. So when your left plus right link is on, the input knob moves with the output that goes against it. So you can instantly crank the input, drive more signal into the circuitry, and then compensate the output. But sometimes, and this will be extremely useful because of the expansion and gate circuits, you want to have an offset. You want to establish some kind of added gain or reduced gain, and then you still want to have this behavior to find the sweet spot between left and right. So Kiive did it in a nice way because this internal part is different than what happens with the input and output. But if you do this with the output, with the main one, the rightmost side of the plugin, you still have the offset. And it's a small thing, but I think it really helps to find the right point in gain structuring your sound, especially for the channel input and output knobs. The compressor circuit is pretty straightforward. It's got 1-to-1 ratio, which is nice. That helps you sort of bypass the compression, but still have it in the circuit. 2, 3, 5, 10, and 20-to-1. I particularly like the 5-to-1 and 3-to-1 for no reason, but the unit has its own sound. It's an FET compressor, but it's got kind of a different vibe. It's really nice. The threshold goes from low, highest, to high, lowest. Yes, I know what you're thinking. Release goes from fast to slow. It's variable. And you have 3 attack settings. 25 milliseconds, then you got 2.5, which is 10 times down, and then you have 100 times down, 0.25 milliseconds. This will remove any doubt of having maybe not enough of a compression speed or maybe too slow of a compressor. The 3 settings really dictate how the unit perceives your transients. So this makes it kind of easy if you're having issues with compression timings, right? Peak limiter on, off, and pre-emphasis. Expander and gate off, expansion, or gate. And the attack of the expander can be calibrated to 2, 40, or 0.02 milliseconds. Again, the timings were made because they kind of knew in broadcast they had recurring transient formats or crest factors, if that makes any sense. Then the expander itself has a range from 0 to 20, which is the maximum range you want to give it. And the threshold again from low to high, again from highest to lowest, and the release again variable from fast to slow. Then, as we said, we've got the sidechain, and we can put these into mid-side, which then with unlinked controls will give us full mid-side processing capabilities. There really isn't much more to this unit, whether we're talking about the analog unit or the faithful reproduction for these plugins. So it's about how it sounds, right? So let's put it to use. This could be really the perfect sketch, as I said, because it's got tons of percussion, and we're going to use the Complexx on pretty much all the tracks that we can find. Let's hear first these 8 bars, how they sound in, just whatever they have to offer. And this is it. It's pretty straightforward. I used this sketch to draw ambient versions of it. There's a lot of stuff, and it's nice how this sort of pack of tracks works, whether we're engaging everything or not. Now, I have added a couple drum tracks, like real drums. I want you to listen to this kit by itself without the compressor and then with. As you heard, it's a massive change in soundstage. And it's kind of a complicated preset that I've devised, but as you can hear, the cymbals are staying there because they're on a separate track. I didn't want the cymbals, they're kind of a futuristic foundry kind of sound, to be affected, right? Now, why would I do this? Again, it wasn't part of the sketch, I've added these, but it's a typical example. The drums by themselves are out of context, and I'm gonna let you hear this kit in the contextualization of the sketch, but without the compressor. They're nice, they work, but they're just put there. And sometimes you don't need things to be really audible, really, forward for the audience. I actually like my drums when they're simulating acoustic kits to be within the machine, in the context of the machine. So let's hear it without, and then I'm gonna engage it, and you're gonna hear how the Complexx 760 just puts the real kit into the picture of what I'm designing. It could make sense both ways, for sure. Some people might want to have just a clear-cut, dry kit in front, but to me, it doesn't make sense. I like how 2 seconds after you've put this kit with the Complexx in context, you can really hear the depth of all of these machine pieces working like, again, a factory of sorts, right? Factory of sound. Now, I propose we just take a look at this drum kit with a single instance of Complexx, and we experiment with how the single stages sound, because it will make it easier for us to understand. So it's a fairly simple, straightforward groove, makes it easier for us to evaluate. And I'm gonna keep gain link on and the left-right link. I don't want any peak limiting at first and any expansion gating, right? Let's hear how the compressor sounds. Does it remind you of anything? To me, it sounds like an 1176 without the shenanigans, which is really good because it just works on the back of the drum kit. I think this is why a lot of people like it. It just brings a lot of the background information forward, but it doesn't move the front. It doesn't sacrifice that. It doesn't go with the mojo of an 1176 for sure. They're different units, but it's musical, right? So I'm gonna experiment with more comp attacks and move the releases and just the ratios so we get our ears accustomed to it. Also, I'm gonna use the sidechain because it just draws the sound to different destinations. And here is where it excels. Just 2 to 4 dBs of compression if you want to use it the classic way. The sidechain I haven't even engaged yet, but it doesn't freak out on the lows as an 1176. It's a little bit more versatile. Now here we're kind of taming the transients, if we put the comp attack to 25 milliseconds or even 2.5 instead of 0.25, we're gonna get even more of the original transient, and this really masks the FET style. It just sounds better. There's more articulation between the air in between the hits, right? It's just ever so slight, and we're doing 4. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. This is already 3-to-1 working. And it's a different vibe from 1176. Sometimes an 1176, at least in my music, would be too cliche, if that makes any sense. Still sounds good. This one has more of an intricate way. Now I'm gonna play with the tone control, high frequency versus low frequency tone shaping. It's an EQ, but it's not an EQ. But the curves are so nicely done because people had broadcast in mind and they knew common areas that sort of always work for broadcast stations. And it does work here as well. It just brings the attention forward towards the snare, the air of the kit, and the samples. Now I want to play with just the limiter. So I've put the ratio to 1-to-1, the expander gate is off as it was before, and I'm moving the switch for peak limit to on. What happens is, if it limits, it's going to turn on its lim red light. And I'm not going to see any gain reduction on the meters, but if it doesn't happen, I can push the input in, right, of the circuitry. So I'm going to move the input up, the output goes down because my linking is on, and we're going to try and find a point in which we're getting some limiting on the transients. It makes things a little bit louder, and that would make sense if you really want to compensate it more. Again, you have an offset that you can dial in here to make it a little bit more of a ghost kind of limiter, but it's effortless and it brings, again, the kit up. What happens in comparison with the compressor is that we no longer have that kit jumping to grab me. It just does not happen. And for some people, and in some cases, that is something you want. In other cases, it's something you don't want. But it happens, and it's a lid put on top of our kit. Now we play with the expander and gate. So ratio 1-to-1, the peak limiting off, we reset our inputs and outputs, and we're gonna try and play with the range of the expander. I'm gonna use expander first, the release at its fastest, the threshold all the way up, but with the range of 0. So what does it happen? I'm gonna put an attack of 40 milliseconds so that we have kind of a long trailing behavior. Now, this is a nice starting point. With the range at 0 and the expander on, we're telling the expander to expand all the time because the threshold's all the way up, but the expansion range can only have a maximum of 0 dB. So it's kind of weird, but it allows me to go between off and exp, and you will hear that there is a shift in gain. It's louder when it's expanding. It sounds to me as if the frequency profile is also a little bit different. Could be, because it's the analog unit probably is not perfect, but the magic happens when you're moving the threshold to a point that makes sense in the groove, because your expanded range is louder than the original, but the expanded parts are lower, and so it increases the movement. So why would somebody use this? Well, it's in conjunction with the compressor that things become interesting. Let's play with the attacks, find a part that makes it move somehow, and then compress. Okay, I like this. Now we instantiate the compressor, super high threshold, then we drop it down. Now this, coupled with a tiny little bit of sidechain to not let the kick just sink too much. Have you heard it? It's a nice sidechain, right? It just allows you to just pinpoint that. Now I'm gonna move the tone and then we're gonna do a bypass. It brought the snare back into a little bit more of a focus. Not in volume, but in the emphasis of the highs, right? So it feels closer. It's rebalancing. Now off and then on. You hear the air has now become sort of claustrophobic, but it just blooms around the main hits and then gets sucked away. It's a really nice effect, and in the context of music, it can really give a lot of gated feeling, although it's not really gating. We're just using the expander to emphasize the compressor behavior. It's really cool. Now we're gonna use what we've learned to just sound design our way through the different tracks, and we're going to try and find sweet spots for each of them. For example, these two grooves together. This could be a nice moment to just do a little bit of mid-side, right? So I'm going to switch it to mid-side and I'm going to unlink left to right, and I want to compress the sides differently. Even that completely redesigned the aggression factor of these two tracks. Now you could say, well, the bypassed version is quieter, but it isn't in the low frequency spectrum. But I am sidechaining fairly high, 333 Hertz, so my package of high frequency detail is reduced in dynamic range and pushed forward, so it adds just this sort of, as I said, aggression factor, right? Pretty nice. Let's move on. Here's something that sounds completely different in terms of crest factor. Without, what could we do here, right? Let's try it out. Could sound different and better. So I'm gonna slightly compress. You hear how, again, forward it comes, but it just allows the reverbs. This is a live session, by the way. There's all live pedals and synthesizers to grow on the low frequency content because of such a high side chain, 3 kilohertz, insane, right? Really nice. Let's keep going. Let's go for mainstream stuff. kicks. These are my main kicks, and they're playing in weird patterns in this whole collection of sketches and music that I'm working on. And how can these compressor work on it? I have no idea. We're gonna try it out. This sounds fairly nice. It's adding the detail in the high clicks part than the kick wouldn't otherwise have. And it's the difference between adding another layer of kicks or just finding it out with the compressor. So this could be nice. I'm gonna try it also with some peak limiting to see if it just helps leveling the kick, because when you lower the volume of these very important subby kicks, you might find that they glue themselves out, unglue themselves. Completely different. The low mids now are scooped, but the sub is very clear. So really nice. The pre-emphasis completely gave it a different approach. Wow, this is really nice. Now I liked that nose in the kick. It made it pretty obnoxious, and that's what I wanted. But normally you would want to clean that part and you would use an EQ for it. But here it just worked even better. It just keeps the movement there. Let me find out something else that could be interesting. Some sort of, how about synth land now, something different. I like this, but I want to try and see if I can, again, redesign the mid side, unlinking, and I want the side to move a lot. The expander attack was not allowing me to kind of find some point in which it's moving, but now I'm gonna make the mid darker and the side brighter. This giving us a little bit more width, and I'm gonna actually expand the width as well. What I did with this last pad and what I've done with the kicks could make perfect sense as an example of, it doesn't matter if you've used these or not in the analog domain. If this was more of a broadcast unit, it's got a sound, and hear out how the soundstage takes a different direction, which is compelling and it could be interesting. So without first, and then I'm gonna turn it on both the pad and the kicks. There's nothing else, it's 2 tracks. We could argue that the dark version was intentionally like that there's an oppressive, kind of darker, deeper, muddier feel for sure. But there's one thing I like from the on version, which kind of surprised me. The listener has fewer escape routes. There's nowhere to go. The pad is surrounding you and it's kind of claustrophobic, but it's leaving the perfect space for the kicks to just push in front of you and give you that sort of unsettling feel, right? So these 2 compressors have been working on the frequency spectrum as well, which is what dynamic processors do as well. They're not, you EQ to compress and you compress to EQ sometimes. The two things are really interacting now, and it's interesting. And this is just with two instances of this compressor. We could go on for hours. We would find different new examples, signature moves, but what happens is we keep seeing that it's dependable, it's addictive, it handles your sound stage, it moves your frequency spectrum around, the responses of the highs versus lows, the transients are separated, the environmental changes are really nice. So thank you for joining me. I hope this was useful, as usual, give you ideas and inspired you to just try it out or apply these principles to whatever weird combination of instruments and tools you have. As usual, we're gonna see each other in the next video. Ciao.